The celebration of 40 hours devotion goes back many, many years in the history of the church. It was brought to the United States from Europe by St. John Newman, a fellow Redemptorist, the fourth bishop of Philadelphia. And it was first celebrated in 1853, and in 1866, dioceses throughout the United States were given permission to celebrate this special devotion. And it's heartwarming that so many years after St. John Newman brought this devotion to the United States, that it's still deeply rooted in the spirituality of the Church of Philadelphia. I guess the first question we need to ask ourselves is, why 40 hours? The number 40 is very symbolic in the Bible. We have 40 days of Lent. Jesus was tempted 40 days in the wilderness by the devil. During the story of the flood, it rained 40 days and 40 nights. The Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years. But the real meaning for 40 has to do with the time. We estimate about 40 hours between Jesus' death, when he was laid in the tomb, and when he rose again from the dead on Easter morning. So this is a time when we celebrate Jesus' presence with us and the intimate connection between his death and his resurrection. In our second reading today from 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says, "I preach Jesus crucified." But you can only preach Jesus crucified if he is risen. And this gospel message was a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. And yet Paul says, the foolishness of God is wiser than any human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than any human strength. My brothers and sisters, to this day, to preach Christ crucified is still a stumbling block to many and foolishness to many others, because we are dealing here with a mystery that is beyond human understanding. In today's gospel, Jesus says, "You destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." And they laughed at him. They laughed at him. Just to give you a brief history of the temple, it was completed in 957 BC by King Solomon, the son of David. It was destroyed in 856 BC when King Nebuchadnezzar came and ravaged Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and took the people into exile. It was then rebuilt when they returned from exile 70 years later. So this is the second temple that Jesus is talking about, and it was reconstructed by Herod the Great in 20 BC and destroyed a second time in 70 AD by the Romans to put down a Jewish revolt. And Jesus says, "You destroy this temple and I will build it in 3 days." He's not talking about the temple. He's talking about his body. And they laughed at him because he says, "We've been reconstructing this temple for 46 years. And you're going to rebuild it in 3 days?" My brothers and my sisters, the original temple had what was called the Holy of Holies. It was the place where only the priest could go. And in that Holy of Holies, there were 3 things. There was the Ark of the Covenant, which held the 10 Commandments, the tablets of the 10 Commandments. which God inscribed when Moses was on Mount Sinai. And that is reflected in our first reading today from the book of Exodus, where we have very clearly the commandments which the people of God were to follow in order to keep his covenant. There was also a table with what was called showbread. And this was bread which was made from very fine flour and stacked on the table, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Also in the ark was a small pot with manna from heaven, which fed the Jews during their sojourn in the desert. And also there was the rod of Aaron, a symbol of the priesthood, a symbol of the power of the priesthood. And in addition to that, there was an altar where the priests of the old law offered animal sacrifice. My friends, the theme of this 40-day retreat, this 40 hours of devotion, is Eucharist, sacrament of faith, sacrament of hope, sacrament of love. I got that from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 13, which says, listen carefully, in the end, there are three things that last: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. And if the Eucharist is truly, as the Second Vatican Council tells us, the source and summit of the Christian life, then it too must be a sacrament of faith, a sacrament of hope, and a sacrament of love. In the end, there are three things that last: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. I want everyone in this church to repeat with me, please. In the end, there are three things that last: faith, hope, and love.
Faith, hope, and love.
And the greatest of these is love.
And the greatest of these is love.
One more time. In the end, there are three things that last: faith, hope, and love.
Faith, hope, and love.
And the greatest of these is love.
And the greatest of these is love.
So during this 40 hours devotion, I'm going to use some images to help us understand this. And the first is the image of a journey. You remember, the Jews wandered 40 years in the desert, and what they carried in front of them was the Ark of the Covenant, which held the law, it held the manna, it held the rod of Aaron, which is a foreshadowing of this Mass, because what we have in the tabernacle is an ark. It's another word for ark, tabernacle. And what we have here is a table, which is also an altar. And I'm going to emphasize that the tabernacle is a symbol of faith. The table is the symbol of fellowship and hospitality, and the altar is a symbol of sacrifice. Those are what my talk's going to be over the next 3 days. But I implore you, this is a time when Catholic spirituality and the message of Christ is very important for the people of this parish. The simple gospel message is this: God entered our world in the mystery of the Incarnation. He gave himself to us completely in the mystery of his passion and death. He became nourishment for us in the mystery of the Eucharist, and a source of hope for us in his resurrection and ascension into heaven. But my brothers and sisters, this was not enough for God. God did not only want to enter our world, he wants to enter your world. Because he made all of his creation for you. And he wants to dwell in your heart. St. Alphonsus Liguori the founder of my order, the order to which St. John Newman belonged, and he, by the way, was the first to profess religious vows as a Redemptorist in the New World, says, paradise for God, heaven for God, is to dwell in the human heart. We understand what heaven might like be for us, but what is heaven for God? He wants to dwell in your heart. And that's why he's given us the Eucharist, because he becomes, at Mass, present, body, blood, soul, and divinity. He said, I will never leave you, not until the end of the age. He rests here in the tabernacle. He comes to us in Holy Communion. And when the priest or deacon comes and says, body of Christ, we are claiming that we are members of Christ's glorified humanity. That we have not only our individual personalities, but we have a corporate personality, something which goes far beyond what we could ever imagine. So my brothers and sisters, during these 40 hours, when we remember that time between Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection from the dead, let us mourn with him, but let's also have faith in him, hope in him, and let us love him. Because he loved us so much that he gave up his own son, that he may dwell in your heart and my heart. Ultimately, we are called to be living tabernacles. Ultimately, we are called to have a table of fellowship with family and friends. And ultimately, we are called to be selfless and give up our lives for others on the altar of our lives. May God bless us. Have a good 40 days devotion, 40 hours devotion, and let us say one more time, in the end, there are three things that last. Faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. God bless you.